So in our application, we want to send HTTP requests. And I think a good place to start with that is actually to allow us to add new products and actually store products, where we then click on that save icon here, not just locally in memory, but actually on a server. So that in the next steps thereafter, we can start fetching the data from the server, for example, for this list, but of course also for our shop, that we can then store the favorite status on the server when we change it, that we can store our orders on the server, and of course that we also store edits or updates to our products on the server, and that when we delete a product here, we obviously delete it on a server. That would be the plan. So it all starts with enabling us to add new products. And to send HTTP requests in Flutter, we need a specific package. The HTTP package, which you can easily find if you search for Flutter HTTP, or on pub.dev, you simply search for HTTP there. This is a package which makes it easy for you to send HTTP requests from inside your Flutter app. You install it like all other packages. Under the installing tab, you copy that dependencies entry you find here, and you add that to your pubspec.yaml file below your other dependencies. And once you save that file, Flutter should automatically go ahead, or the Flutter extension in Visual Studio Code should automatically go ahead and fetch that package. If it doesn't, then you can go into a terminal and there run flutter packages get. So with the package added to the project and installed, we can now start sending HTTP requests. And with the Firebase backend, we want to send them to this URL, or to a URL that's based on that URL. And for that, let's first of all understand how we actually send HTTP requests to such a backend like this one. And I say like this one because it's really representative of any backend you could be using. When sending HTTP requests from inside your Flutter app, you have various options. And typically, it always depends on the server you're talking to. The server you're talking to decides which kind of requests it's able to handle. So you always need to check out the documentation of the backend you're working with. Unless you're, of course, the developer who wrote the code for the backend, then you should know how it works. Typically, you will communicate with a so-called REST API when working with a backend from your Flutter app. That's the most common web server you use for front ends or for front-end applications, so for user interfaces like your Flutter app. It's the most common scenario you talk to, and for such REST APIs, the idea is that you send a HTTP request that's made up of an endpoint, which in the end is the URL, and a HTTP verb to a server, and on that server, depending on that combination of URL and verb you chose, a certain action is executed. Now you can only use combinations the server knows, of course. That's why you have to read the docs, or you write your own web server which accepts certain combinations. You'll of course see concrete examples throughout this course. Now, as I said, the endpoint is really just the URL you target. And for different URLs, different things could happen. For example, with myserver.com/posts, if you send a request to that, you might want to load all posts or add a new post to the list of posts. And that action is also determined by the HTTP verb you choose, therefore, because you can send different kinds of HTTP requests. The most common request, which we all know when we open a page in the browser, is a GET request. When you open a page in the browser, a GET request is sent to get the data that should be displayed in the browser. You can also send such GET requests to such RESTful APIs, or REST APIs, which is the short form. And the idea here always is that this should get you some data. A single piece of data, a list of data, really depends on the server you're working with and the app you're building. But GET is not the only HTTP verb you can use. You can also post data. You can send post requests to a server. If you send a post request, you typically want to store data, append some data to an existing list of data. Again, what actually happens is always decided by the server. It's the server-side code that runs. But the convention is, when writing such a server, that post requests to a certain URL are handled in a way that adds data to an existing list or whatever your server, your application does. So this adds data. And of course, with that, I typically mean that this also at some point gets added, gets written into a database. GET, on the other hand, returns data from a database typically. Now, besides adding new data, you might also want to update existing data. And this can be done with the patch request, which updates data, or as an alternative, you can send a put request, which replaces data. The difference is that patch typically just edits the fields or the pieces of data that changed, whereas put takes some new data block and replaces an existing one with it. Again, it depends on your web server which type of requests it accepts and what it does in detail then. The official documentation is always the place to go, of course. The official documentation of your web service, I mean. Delete requests can also be sent, and as the name suggests, you typically would choose those if you want to delete some data, some resource on the server. So these are the different kinds of HTTP requests you can send if your server supports them for the URL, for the endpoint you're sending them to. And we'll now work with these HTTP verbs and also with different endpoints throughout this module.